So I'm really excited to welcome everybody back to our Conversations with Experts at Home that we started during the pandemic for people to get great information while they were at home. And I'm really excited to have with me today Dr. Kat, who is a specialist in maternal mental health and working with families who have new children or are going through the process of having a child. And I'm very excited to have you, especially at this time. I've had two friends who've had babies during COVID-19, obviously conceived before COVID-19, but who've had to deal with having children during this time. And I'm just really excited to have you, and I hope you and your family are well during this time.
Thank you. We are. And yours?
Yes, we're being very careful at home. And so I've basically been at home. I'm seeing all my clients at home. I would imagine you are too.
Yeah. Yep. I'm in my house.
Good. So I was wondering what you're seeing is different for parents today. Usually welcoming a baby into the world is a pretty exciting process, but also comes with a lot of challenges. I have two children who are adults now, but I do remember that it was, it can be quite difficult, that transition to parenthood. And I just wondered what you would say about what you're seeing different right now, because parents right now are dealing with all kinds of other struggles around even giving birth to their children.
Oh, so many. Yeah, it's a very long list, unfortunately. During a time that's already a stressful transition and a huge time of growth and change, in good times when things are settled and fine in the world for the most part. But right now there's increased, like, lots of anxiety, a lot of anxiety around COVID itself, but also the process of decision making in how to care for the pregnancy, how to care for themselves, because options are so limited right now. People who used to be able to go to the gym or freely walk and not have to worry about that stuff now have to think through everything they do. And that brings with it inherently quite a bit of anxiety, let alone just the health of pregnancy. Certainly going to doctor's visits is different, where, like, people used to be able to have their partners come. Now partners are not allowed in a lot of times. And so people are getting very creative about, having spouses or partners or family members on the phone with them, or FaceTime or something like that when they're in with their physician or midwife or doula for that matter. And in the beginning of COVID, there was a lot of stress around anxiety of who could actually be in the birthing room. And for a while there, nobody was allowed, and that was just obviously for the health and safety of people working, and of the birthing person. But wow, my immediate concern was how traumatizing that could be, and how anxiety producing that could be for people to have to birth alone when that clearly wasn't their hope or plan. So there's just a lot. People who have a toddler and who are pregnant and don't have daycare that their toddler used to go to, and now they have baby at home and they're very, very pregnant and having low energy. I mean, there's just any way that you could imagine a pregnant person could be affected. They kind of are, and there's some positive benefits too. I can surely get into those, but if you'd like. So for people who have conflict in families, it's been relieving to not have to tell people that they don't want them in the birthing room, or that they don't want visitors coming over, after a day, 2 days, 3 days, or whatever. It's kind of like a natural boundary that people who have tension and stress in their families can rely on, and not have to go through, the stress and strain of difficult conversations or disappointing family members or people's feelings being hurt. So that's a benefit, so to speak, that I've been seeing a lot lately.
Yeah. I was thinking about the two people I know who had children. One really wanted some of her friends there as well as her partner. And it was really her baby got born very beginning of June, and it was very unsure for a long time whether even her husband could be there.
Right, right. So stressful. All of these unknowns.
Yeah, he finally was able to be there, but then
Oh,
also, her sort of plan of having a baby was sharing it with her friends. She couldn't do that
yeah.
exactly either.
Yeah, it's a lot of people are trying to make decisions about what to do, and when all of the options don't feel great, it kind of ends up being the least worst decision in many cases, because it's not what people want in their pregnancy or birthing or postpartum experience.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's really true. And so, but people are having to kind of adapt, and it's
Oh, big
difficult
time.
at
Yeah,
a time where you're already adapting a lot.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Um, what are some of the risks for developing postpartum depression and anxiety, which a lot of people deal with? I know.
Yeah, the rates are much higher than most people think. It's 1 in 5 develop some kind of perinatal mental health condition that could be starting in pregnancy or postpartum. Risk factors can range in many different areas, but certainly if the pregnant person has any history of their own of anxiety, depression, um, trauma, or any other mental health diagnosis, that is a risk factor. Or even if it's in the family, if there is any family history of a diagnosis. What can get a little bit difficult here is that, just even a generation ago, birthing people weren't noticing or calling it postpartum depression or anxiety. So sometimes when people go to get a history of their family, they might say, oh, it was fine, I did what I had to do. But it's also possible that they could have had some kind of condition in postpartum, but just didn't know what to call it.
Right, or didn't get any help around it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there wasn't that much help. Again, even just a generation ago. There is now though, so that's good. So yeah, any family history or personal history. Certainly, histories of trauma play a particular role in this, and that, I mean, there's lots of ways that trauma can play out, but yeah, yeah, that can be a big one. And yeah, any current contextual stressors, certainly. I mean, which obviously COVID and
Yeah.
whatnot, but financial strain, relational strain, um, access to resources, definitely, like care, adequate care. Um, yeah, history of stress, and those are just some of them.
Yeah. And I think it can be a bit hard to tell whether it's actually something clinical or not, because it seems like, just giving birth in itself often makes people more emotional,
Yeah.
just again, hormonally what's going on, as well as psychologically what's going on, you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. There's for about 80% of the population, there's a really common experience called baby blues, and
Hmm.
that usually lasts within the first couple of weeks postpartum and resolves on its own, generally with adequate rest and nutrition and support.
Hmm.
But certainly during that period of time, if symptoms are very intense and our people are not feeling like themselves that early on, and if symptoms and complications are lasting longer than those 2 weeks, 3 weeks pushing it, then we might be looking at something like a perinatal mental health condition.
So that's one way people can tell, is if it's how severe it is and also how long it's lasting.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely.
They really do need some help. And I
Hmm.
think, we're in such a funny situation where people aren't getting support that they usually would. Like
Oh,
usually
right.
they often have maybe their mother come, or a friend
Hmm.
come stay with them, or other people help, or, even delivering people meals people are a little
Oh, right.
concerned about.
Yeah, it's just all so many restrictions on what kind of support you can get. People are having to get very creative about how to get that support. Zoom can only, last for so long in terms of fulfilling that need. But
It
yeah,
doesn't
people
all
are getting creative.
complete for you. Unfortunately, on Zoom, you can't do that for
Yeah.
somebody. And I think partly friends and family are feeling the strain too, because they want to be there, they want to hold the baby, they want to see the baby.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All this restriction on everyone, and it brings a lot of tension sometimes, especially for family members who don't have the same view or the same beliefs on how to manage. I've seen a lot of conflict in that way with people who are being very protective of their newborn baby and family members who don't understand or who feel like we're safe, we're fine, why can't we just see the baby? But it's one of those things again where individual decision making is fraught with all of these new considerations.
Right, right. And I've seen households where they have teenagers as well, for instance, and the
Yeah,
teenagers may not be following the family's rules around COVID in the way that their parents might want them to.
right.
And then you have a new baby on top of it, it becomes a much scarier thing just because people feel very protective, I think,
Yeah,
those times.
that is so true.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Um, do you have any advice for new parents who are feeling isolated and alone at this time?
Yeah, there are things that you can do. Again, it's limited and kind of the in COVID world having to be creative. Again, depending on your level of comfort, sometimes having if you need literal physical interaction with people, but are okay with distance interactions, going to a park and sitting far apart. Is something that people have been doing. Certainly, family gatherings are similar. Um, but there's been an expanding resource available on the internet for support groups, specifically for stress during pregnancy or postpartum. And a lot of those resources are free. So if somebody's needing more than just friend support and wants to be in community with people who feel similarly, they absolutely can access a lot of free online support groups right now. And therapy too. Like, you and I are both working from home, and therapy online has been so helpful for so many people. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I know I have a friend and colleague who's doing, support groups for people that are pregnant online. And
great.
then, they often follow up after they've had their babies too. They're
Yeah. It's so
looking to,
nice to have a place to go where you can feel connected, especially because there's a lot of physical isolation at home of partners working, and people not being able to come over. So, you know, some people relying on support groups or Zoom meetings, but even text messaging back and forth with a friend, just getting, reassurance occasionally and just feeling like there's someone sort of out there that you can connect with. And tether yourself to somebody else in a way that feels supportive is really anything at this point is
right,
can be
that you can
helpful.
do like that is helpful. Yeah. And I
Mhm.
think you have to remember that even though it's not the ideal of what you maybe wanted, it's a lot better than nothing.
Yeah,
Keep those
yeah, it
things.
really is. It's
Yeah.
so hard to make these adjustments while you're already trying to make adjustments. And the sadness and sometimes devastation of loss of what the hopes were for pregnancy or the hopes were for the postpartum, like you said, being wanting to be able to share this little bundle with your friends and family. That's a lot of grief. It's a lot of dealing with disappointment.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of hard decisions for people, should they expand their bubble or not? Or,
Mhm.
you know, what are the risks that are acceptable?
Yeah.
Um, what would you say to mothers who feel that they can't balance it all? Especially during this time, with, like you said, childcare, maybe a new baby, and maybe there's still work or,
Hmm.
all of that going on.
Yeah, you can't. It's you can't balance it all. It's a ridiculous amount of pressure, and you don't have enough hands, arms, toes, fingers, whatever, to deal with all of this. And that, and unfortunately, is just the reality. But I see so often people trying to push themselves into like, well, it looks like so and so is doing it, so I should be able to do it, which is true in non-COVID times. But especially with these pressures, just worry that you're letting your children down or you're not giving them enough attention or you're not making meals in the way you used to make them. I'm all for lowering expectations right now, honestly. I think it's a disservice to primary caregivers and families, frankly, like everyone in the system, to be assuming that you should be able to do everything you've always done, plus all the new stuff, and do it well with a smile and be grateful all the time. I just, it's just unrealistic. That's not what it feels like on the ground. That's not what people are actually experiencing. So let the dishes sit in the sink. They'll be there tomorrow. Those kinds of things where it can feel really pressured. Well, I have to attend to all of these details in this, 1 or 2 hours while the baby is asleep. And then sometimes the dishes just need to hang out in the sink.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned sleep. I think that's one thing that new families really struggle with is the whole sleep issue.
Yeah.
They now have a baby that's waking up, or one of my friends who had a baby recently, this baby doesn't sleep well unless it's sleeping on a person.
Yeah.
He's a real sweet little guy, but he's also not easily comforted, and he needs, that contact to be asleep. And that means that neither of them are getting a lot of sleep.
It's I think the number one challenge is sleep, and that's actually a factor that makes everything worse too. Any loss of sleep for any consecutive period of time really does a number on your brain's capacity to function, to process, you just lose patience, you feel irritable, it's hard to think clearly. And so certainly if you're in a relationship and having conflict with a partner who's also sleep deprived, conversations really aren't that productive because everyone is kind of on their last thread in a way. So sleep is, if people can do nothing else, I suggest that working on a sleep schedule for the partners, for the parents in some way where they can take turns and each of them get a chunk of sleep when possible. It's harder for people who are breastfeeding because, baby needs to eat when baby needs to eat. But if pumping and bottle feeding is available, then having a partner or family member feed the baby can be really helpful. But this kind of broken sleep that postpartum folks get is the worst kind of sleep. You're not getting into the deep REM sleep. You're not getting any of the reparative, restorative sleep. So I will ask people, how long did you sleep? How long did you sleep last night? Or have you been sleeping? And they'll say, oh, like 6 or 7 hours. And I'll ask, be sure, is that consecutive? And it's always no.
No, because you gotta be breastfed in the middle of that. No.
Right. Yeah. So really they're sleeping 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And then, wondering why they feel like they're losing their mind. Well,
yeah. What happened to any of us if we were sleeping like that?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard. Yeah, it's really tough. So, sometimes it's easier than others to negotiate a sleeping plan with your partner or family member. But in those first several months, it's not forever, but even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week that you can get a solid 5 hours of a stretch at minimum, ideally. This is in an ideal world. It just does wonders for your mental health and outlook on everything, really. It doesn't cure everything, but it really does contribute to well-being in such a profound way for postpartum folks.
Yeah, and that can be so nice if you can get that help from some, friend or family member too. And it used to be much easier pre-COVID, but so like my nephew who's 2 years old we used to keep him one night a week and let his parents get some sleep, and
that's magic.
That's a nice break. But
sure.
1 night a week for us was not a big deal. So
yeah, and I think that's an important point too. Sometimes when moms are in the throes of how difficult it is to have a baby who wakes up all the time, they often feel guilty for asking for help, like, oh, well, they need to sleep too, and they have things to do also. But they're forgetting that one night is very different from your every night. And once like you were saying, the one night didn't affect you too much. You had a day to recover or whatever it was.
Mhm.
Um, but because when you're in that fog of sleep deprivation and whatever else is going on, depression or anxiety, um, the feelings of not wanting to be a burden on other people are like pretty common and come up quite a bit. So sometimes people won't ask for help, even though they are desperate for sleep or any kind of relief. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I encourage people to ask anyways. People can say no, but if you never ask, then you just never get the help.
Right. And I think people forget that it can be like a gift because it really connects you to that child for the
Yeah,
rest of your life, you know?
yeah, absolutely. It is a special bond, even if it's not the child you birthed.
Absolutely. And I think that's important that, because I know, I hear a lot of parents say, well, it'll be a burden. Well, it's also a gift.
Yeah,
You think of it
that
that way. It's a lot.
that is so important, really.
Yeah. Um, what are some of the most common maternal mental health disorders that you see in
Mhm.
your?
Yeah, primarily it's a mix of anxiety and depression. It's a rare that I'll see depression alone with like no symptoms of anxiety at all. It's more common that I'll see anxiety alone without depression symptoms, but depending on the length of time they've been suffering, certainly depression can still come. So yeah, anxiety and depression are the most common, but people also develop, certainly if they have a history, but can develop panic symptoms, panic attacks, panic disorder, um, obsessive compulsive disorder that they might be experiencing for the first time in pregnancy or postpartum, or has risen to a level of intensity that they're now noticing it.
Hmm.
That's a particularly difficult condition to deal with because it comes with intrusive thoughts. And specifically during the perinatal period, the intrusive thoughts are often related to worry about the baby specifically. So, I call it anxiety for two. It's you have your own experience, but then the experience and connection you have with your child, the intrusive thoughts can be about worry about harm coming to them, and many, many other things. I can go into quite a few details, but
Like worrying about the baby and the baby's health, that kind of thing. I know that I've seen that a lot with people, you know.
yeah, worry about their health. And, there's some level of vigilance in being a new parent that's totally normal.
Right.
Checking on the baby, making sure they're okay and breathing and safe and happy. Yes, but with OCD, it becomes obsessive. Like people have a hard time going to sleep. They will stay up all hours just watching the monitor, listening for things, and not be able to sleep because of the obsessiveness around worry. Or intrusive thoughts by nature are really disturbing, but when it involves your child, it's just through the roof upsetting, and
Yeah.
often like horrific. Because people will get visuals of things happening, and it's so disturbing to them. Why, I'll hear so often, why do I think this? I would never think that about anybody or my baby, or I don't want to do any of this, or why is it coming into my head? And the level of distress is palpable. It's so intense.
Yeah.
um,
And people don't know that other people have experienced this either. I mean, they
right.
really feel odd, like this is only happening to me. But
Hmm.
you've seen that with a lot of different people. And sometimes I
Yeah.
find saying that to them can kind of calm them down a little bit, like, oh, I'm not the only one who ever had this thought, you know. It
Yeah.
doesn't want to do something bad. It doesn't mean, something horrible is going to happen or
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the nature of them, because they're so alarming, it just brings up shame and embarrassment and the feeling the need to keep it to yourself because, oh my gosh, what will people think?
Mhm.
And then it leads to further isolation and, more anxiety, more feelings of depression. It's a nasty cycle.
Right. And it seems like if somebody is having that experience, well, it's not totally uncommon. It would be probably a good idea to seek help,
Oh, yeah.
professional help at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially, yeah, if it's interfering with your ability to sleep and get through the day, like not being able to sleep when you have the opportunity to sleep is what I
Yeah.
mean. Um, uh, yeah, taking up a lot of time with checking, checking the baby, checking doors, checking windows, whatever it is that's coming up. Um, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it's difficult.
And the anxiety, just if it's not OCD, what kind of form does that take that you see in new mothers?
Yeah,
So,
there's um, it can approach kind of OCD feelings without being an OCD diagnosis. Um, General worry for sure. Am I doing everything okay? Am I doing this good enough? Did I pick the right? I mean, for everything down to the bottle. Is this the right bottle for the baby? Maybe I should try another one. Just a constant process of decision making, but not being sure, not feeling okay
mhm.
about the decisions that they're making, which can lead to feeling like what I hear a lot is like, I don't feel like a good mother or a good parent. I'm not doing good enough for my child. And the anxiety takes them so far out into the future sometimes about worry that, oh, I'm not stimulating them enough. I'm not interacting with them enough. I'm not playing enough. Should I be reading books to them at this age, like, weeks old? Should I, just a concern about how much stimulation they should be having and feeling the pressure to be entertaining them whenever they're awake all the time. And I think it's helpful to remind people that, kids need a break from us too. They don't really want us in their face all the time. And so they need a little bit of an opportunity to just explore the room. And even though they're with you, yes, I do encourage just kind of generally narrating your day to your baby and interacting with them in those ways. But it doesn't have to be all of the time. You don't have to be introducing new stimulus to them all the time. Um, Sometimes they'll get overwhelmed and they'll kind of tell you, they'll pull back and look away and if it's too much. But it can be hard when you feel like all you want to do is be the best parent possible, uh, and that's your internal pressure. And then it's hard to feel like you can be the best parent possible if your goal is perfection, because you can never get there. So that's a really common worry that I see.
Mhm.
So I like
Yeah,
to
and
remind them of that's it's okay to be good enough. Perfect is not necessary.
yeah, I think that's really important, that idea of just being good enough.
Yeah.
Perfection is such a setup for failure. And I also think parents today don't get a lot of training on that, or experience. When we
Yeah.
lived in more close family units, maybe you had taken care of more babies or saw somebody else do it, or you had experience before you had a baby.
Yeah.
And now most new mothers are pretty isolated
Mhm.
without that kind of support or experience.
Yeah, yeah, that's totally true. It's especially now with COVID and everything. There used to be a lot of kind of communal child rearing, um, aunts, uncles, grandparents, whoever would kind of, help out, but we don't really have that as much anymore. Which, I can't give you statistics on this, but I do think that it's a factor in why anxiety levels might be higher. There's the isolation, maybe contributing to feelings of
Mm.
depression and all of those things. Um, and there are other perinatal mental health conditions that come up. Going back to your question of what comes up, certainly the most common
Yeah.
are depression, anxiety, trauma related to birth or postpartum. But less common is bipolar onset in the postpartum, uh, and postpartum psychosis, which is the most rare of the perinatal conditions, but very serious. And if you don't have a family around or people who know, well, either what to
It
look
does
for
occur. Yeah.
or who,
So you're saying if you don't have people around when something like that's going, it could be pretty scary.
yeah,
Like you're
yeah, it
saying,
can
if
be scary.
postpartum psychosis or
Sure.
bipolar disorder.
Yeah, there's a there are some pretty distinct changes in behavior that can happen with those conditions. And if you don't have a lot of family around, or let's say you're home alone and your spouse or partner's not there, or you're a single parent, it can be a lot harder. But when you're in it, obviously, to know that something's not quite right. But certainly people who are experiencing a bipolar disorder or a postpartum psychosis, if they're not in the like full symptomology of it, they do not feel like themselves. But there's also a point at which they're, with postpartum psychosis in particular, they're just not in our kind of shared reality. It's rare.
Yeah.
It's 1 to 2 in 1,000 births will result in postpartum psychosis. And from what we hear on the news, we usually hear about the worst case scenario when postpartum psychosis leads to another very serious outcome, which is infanticide. But that is also extremely rare.
Yeah. But those are conditions where the mother really does need serious psychological help and needs to get connected to that. So if family members or partners or anyone has, an inkling of that, it's probably worth checking it out, even though it is pretty rare, like you said. Those ones, whereas the anxiety or depression is much more common.
Yeah, way more common.
Okay. Yeah, way more common. We did have some questions from people wrote in who were mothers, so I thought
great.
that would be interesting because these are people who. Do you have any suggestions for pregnant women or new parents around how to set boundaries with family members who want to come visit? And I guess especially during COVID, that can be a very touchy thing. Like you said, it could be a good excuse, but it's also, some parents want to just push past that, and some mothers don't want them to.
Yeah, this is a really tough situation because, a lot of people, well, depending on their relationship with their family, might want to be sharing their new child with them, but feel really uncomfortable, have anxiety around people coming around, have maybe more strict processes than they usually do, like wanting hand sanitizer and masks and whatnot. And it can be really hard to set new boundaries with family that you've never had to set before because they've never been in this situation before. And so sometimes people obviously will push past what their need is for the boundary and just do it anyways. Just kind of what I heard recently is to get it over with because it brings a lot of anxiety. But in terms of setting a boundary, if you're worried that your family's going to be disappointed, I think sometimes just calling that out when you talk to them about it, and saying like, I really don't want to disappoint you. I wish that it was easier for us to be together, but right now I'm uncomfortable, or I don't feel like it's safe, or whatever the feeling is for you. But I think when you can, again, this really depends on the state of your relationship with a family member, but if you can center your care about the relationship and lead with that, it can feel less, bad, essentially, to them, that you do care, you do want the same thing that they do, and it's hard for you too that it can't happen right now. Unless it's not, unless you prefer to not see them, then you'd have to craft that some other way.
Right. And then you have to craft it some other way, but it's okay to set boundaries. I think that's one thing people can find difficult. I mean, it used to be, if you walked around with your baby in public, people would want to touch your baby, or, some people would want to hold your baby, and strangers even, and you're like, okay, wait a minute, now I don't think we'd have that happen quite, because people are, especially if they're keeping their 6-foot distance, but it's just interesting, how intrusive people can be around babies sometimes.
Oh my gosh.
Almost feeling like a right to them.
It is strange. It's very strange.
Somebody wrote in and said, it it's really strange. And yeah, it's like personal boundaries don't disappear because I have a baby now. As person wrote in, as a first-time mom, I feel like I have been robbed of so many of the experiences I was looking forward to about pregnancy because of COVID. You know, like a baby shower or sharing it with family and friends. Do you have any suggestions of how to still make this time and experience feel special?
Yeah, that is really tough. And it can feel a lot like grief and deep sadness. Certainly the hopes and expectations that you go into this experience with sometimes don't turn out how you wanted or anticipated. So I think in some ways honoring that grief, if you know have the space or capacity for that, to honor that you wished it could have been different and that you are sad that you missed out on those experiences. Um, I think something that happens with this kind of what I consider a loss is it comes with this guilt too, that feels like you should have been able to have these experiences. Um, and sometimes guilt too, with the feeling like you couldn't be there for your child in the way that you wanted to. Um, and I encourage people to lean on compassion for themselves when they can, if they can. It sounds easy, but it's very hard to bring that softness in for yourself, and realize that you were struggling and you were doing your best to be there and be present and do as many of the tasks as you were able to do, and that still counts. That still is worth something, and it's worth a lot. You have time to still build your connection with your baby. It's not all lost. It's not all gone. There's, sometimes looking back at pictures can be tough because you could see a picture that you don't really remember kind of being there for, or you were physically there but mentally not. So certainly those are pain points, but if judgment is coming up with them, what I encourage people to think of, what would you say to your best friend? What would you say to somebody that you really love if they were going through this? And can you say that to yourself? Is that something you can offer, you in your healing process?
Yeah, I think that's so important. I've had so many people where they'd be really kind to a friend who was going through this, but they're pretty awful to themselves. And that self-compassion is really important piece to try to, get away from self-judgment and have a different attitude toward yourself.
Yeah, yeah. It's so hard.
Like you wouldn't know how to do this, to be compassionate. You just don't do it for yourself always.
Right. And people will say directly,
Yeah,
well, that's okay for everybody else, but not for
it's
me.
much harder. But just that idea of being a good enough parent, you don't have to be perfect, or different, than you would expect from friends.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, you're going to be the parent that your kid needs, and you can't craft yourself around how somebody else parents because their kid might have different needs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important. It's figuring out your kid and what they need. That is the important thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and your style, how you want to be a parent, and this is a process. It doesn't, you don't have a kid and then know everything. Baby doesn't come out and then you know exactly what you're doing. You guys are learning together. It's, a lot of trial and error, and but there's a lot of room too for coming back together and repair if something, doesn't go how you wanted it. And it's really easy to forget that babies and relationships are resilient when there's, when there can be space for coming back together.
Yeah. I think that idea that they're resilient is really important, and that, nothing is, you didn't ruin everything
Not at all. Yeah.
because you didn't do. I really like that idea. I was thinking about what would you say to friends and family who want to be supportive or be there for someone who's pregnant or having a new baby right now, even though they can't maybe physically be there.
Sure. Yeah, again, getting creative about how to be supportive. But also, I mean, you don't have to figure it out on your own as a friend or family member. Listening for the needs of the pregnant or postpartum person can be helpful. Like if they are stating that they're tired, if they're stating that they don't have time to go grocery shopping, or they're worried about X, Y, or Z, doing a little bit of anticipating needs their needs can be helpful. Some people have no problem asking for help and are happy to do that and ask for people to come in. But some people are not. So they might hint around that they are stressed out about something or have a need, but not ever ask directly. So sometimes, bypassing asking them, what do you need, if you know that they're not really going to tell you, and, doing some kind of, doing a kindness for them, a thoughtful action, like, an Instacart order, or, having something delivered to the house, gift cards, that kind of stuff. Sometimes, financial gifts are easier right now. But it can, be going grocery shopping or.
Yeah, I was just thinking sometimes they really needed those financial gifts,
Yeah.
or, having dinner delivered to them or something, that you would have maybe done in person before. We can't,
Yep.
But it would be a nice thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if you've seen all these drive-by birthdays that people are doing, but even like drive-by, saying hello or dropping something off, letting people know that they're not alone, that you're still there, and happy to be there in the way that you can.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Can a non-birthing parent, so the partner or spouse, can they end up getting depressed also, or having this kind of anxiety? Or I've seen in one father that I know who, in anticipating his baby being born, has had his OCD has gotten very extreme around COVID and wanting to protect his wife and unborn baby.
Yeah, absolutely. So dads in particular have about a 10% rate of developing a postpartum depression or other condition. However, if the birthing person or mom is dealing with their own condition, then dads are 50% more likely to develop their own condition. And there is some research around hormonal changes. Testosterone levels drop a bit, and then also there's just increased stress. So obviously, anytime there's increased stress, there's more likelihood of having, especially with OCD, more worry, more intrusive thoughts, higher anxiety. And there's an incredible sense of responsibility that comes along with having a child. And if you are in the world wanting, doing the things that you do to manage your anxiety, it's so easy for it to spill over to the baby or babies, depending on how many there are. And yeah, absolutely. Certainly fathers and spouses, depression, anxiety, the PTSD, like witnessing a traumatic birthing experience. Increase in OCD symptoms, certainly. Yeah, we don't talk about the fathers or spouses or partners as often, but they are going through their own transition as well.
Yeah, very definitely. And during this time with an added anxiety and pressure.
Right.
I was also thinking about, you mentioned traumatic experiences. Those can also interfere with the attachment or the, to the baby sometimes when there's been a really traumatic birthing experience. Either because the mother's health deteriorated after birth, or there's issues with the baby or whatever, those traumatic birthing experiences must have an impact on this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There is more enough, anyways, PTSD related to birth trauma or birth related trauma, even if it's not a direct threat to life to mom or baby. It can be feelings of loss of control in the birthing room. Um, and because trauma, as they say, is in the eye of the beholder, everyone else in the room might think like, oh, hey, baby's out, baby's healthy, mom's good, we're all good, but her internal experience is really what we want to know about, and also the experience of the spouse or partner. Um, yeah, unfortunately, things can happen, and that's really hard to say that to a pregnant person who's looking forward to birth. Um, uh, but in some ways, I'd rather people say like, I'm glad I knew that this was a possibility than hear nobody ever told me that this could happen, and I was shocked and taken aback, and that contributes to the trauma. Um, so it's a delicate balance for sure.
Anyhow, yeah, I was thinking about that because like I know someone who they very much wanted a natural birth. They were doing it at a birthing center with
Yeah.
their doula, and then ended up, because labor wasn't going as smoothly as wanted, and the baby was already a bit late. They felt like the signs were enough to escalate for them moving to the hospital and
Hmm.
ending up with a C-section, which is really not what this person wanted. And there was definitely some post-traumatic stress related to that.
Yeah, that does happen. And I think because there's, I'm sure you've heard the saying like, well, at least the baby's healthy, or like, at least you're okay. Anytime you hear at least, it's it's a sign that it's whatever just happened is being minimized. And
Yeah.
so it's hard for even people who experience that. They're like, yeah, they can feel disappointed is okay that they didn't have the birth that they wanted, but it's sort of less okay to to feel like as intense as PTSD can feel like, because you can rationalize a little bit. Well, I do have my baby. My baby is okay, and the doctors did what they needed to do, and it's easy for us to minimize our own experience um, after something like that. Um, and to your point earlier, it can impact attachment and connection. Sometimes for very like physiological reasons, but also for mental emotional reasons. If you don't get to have the connection right away with baby that you wanted, or if baby's taken to NICU for observation. Um, but sometimes with a traumatic birth, if there's any kind of well, I don't know how much detail to get into here, but if there are things that happen within birth that can affect milk supply. So if your goal was to nurse and breastfeed, and your baby's not, either in the NICU, or you can't because of a physiological response to the traumatic situation, then you're also dealing with that loss as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I think just parents getting scared, about the baby's survival sometimes. I mean, birth is it's not the easiest thing, and it can be quite dramatic at moments, no matter what. I mean, even when it all works out well. But that can be scary, and it can be scary to want to feel attached when you feel like things feel precarious in any way.
Yeah, yeah, that is so true. It's really it can feel like very tentative. If you feel like something bad is going to happen, to want to get into that attachment and connection, which can happen during pregnancy too. But in the postpartum, when baby's there, it's like more pronounced because baby's here and you are having that reticence about it. It is really complicated, and for whoever's listening, this all probably sounds very stressful and super difficult, and maybe even scary. But since we're focusing on kind of things that can be hard and difficult here, but part of the reason I love doing this work is because of how resilient people are, and And when they get that right help and the help that they need, they're just better. Like these conditions are so treatable, and there's so much we can do to help people feel better and, you know, be the parent that they want to be. And that, for me anyways, to be able to see someone go from just this suffering to wellness and being that parent is, I love it. And they don't know when they're in it that they can feel better, but you know, that's one of the messages that in the specialty that we really love to push, because it's true, is that you can feel better with the right help. This is absolutely treatable, and in some ways there's, you can prevent intensity of certain things by planning ahead, being proactive, and putting as much of a plan in place as possible for postpartum.
Right, and to get the support and help you'll need, and to be able to reach out for, you know, you mentioned that there's a lot of good online mental health resources for new moms and families. I would really appreciate if you'd share those with us. Maybe we could provide people with a list in conjunction with this, so that they would have a bunch of ideas about where they could go or how they could access, you know, getting the help that they need. Because there are people in the field with that specialty where that really is the focus too, like yourself, that that kind of help can make all the difference, you know.
Yeah, it
So that we can
can.
understand you,
It really
be there for you.
can. Yeah, I'd say like the main resource that I always give out, and then I can certainly give you a list of other ones later, is Postpartum Support International. They are international, but very specifically within the US, you can call in and talk to somebody. Like there's a helpline, and they can direct you to somebody who's local to you, help find somebody who's on the directory who has perinatal mental health training. And they have many online support groups and ways that fathers and spouses and partners can be supported. And it's just a very rich resource for online support.
That's wonderful. I hadn't heard of that, and that's a great resource for new parents.
Yeah, it's fantastic. They do a lot of great work.
Great. Yeah, no, and I think it is important to let people know that that, you know, there is a lot of hope too. To these conditions are really treatable.
Yeah.
And, you know, and with the right help, you can go on to have a great relationship with your baby and feel fine yourself and get back to being yourself, I guess, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, certainly depending a little bit on your own history and what all is contributing to what's going on for you in pregnancy and postpartum, there can be a pretty quick turnaround in feeling better. There's just so many skills and supports that can be put in place that shore people up. That it's just, it is hopeful. You're right.
Yeah, I think it is. It is hopeful. And it's also good to know that it's normal, you know, that in the sense that a lot of people go through this, you know, it's not, it doesn't make you particularly different or bad in some way. And I think that's important too, to take the stigma out of it. You know, it's not uncommon to have some of these difficulties, and there's great help available.
Yeah.
And that it really makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a ton of stigma, for sure, and I think doubly so for pregnancy and postpartum, because the tow line is that you're all supposed to be happy and joyous, and you know, all these other greeting card type things, but it's much more complex than that. Just like everything else is much more complex than that. And so to normalize that things can be difficult, you're in a growing process, you're in a transitional period of time. Yeah, so things aren't going to be peachy all the time, and as a matter of fact, they can get hard. But to your point, there's a ton of help available, and yeah, you can get back to being yourself.
Well, thank you so much. I think it's a lot of great information, and you're obviously very knowledgeable about this. And I think it's really important for people to hear, especially at this time, you know, because now we have the added thing of COVID and restrictions, and, you know, how do I get help, you know? But I think that's really important. And it's important for people not to just try to, I don't know, tough it out, but to reach out. and get the
Yeah,
help that they might need.
absolutely. I hope everybody hears what you just said. You just don't have to suffer. There's help available. We're here waiting. So yeah, I hope people who are hearing themselves in this or concerned about the symptoms that they're having that might be related to this do reach out for help.
So thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Kat.
Thank you.
And I really love that there's a lot of resources out, and the one you mentioned especially, but any others, we just would be happy to share with people. So thanks very much.
Sure. You're welcome. Thank you.